Very warm welcome to this Commonwealth Heritage Forum talk. Welcome from wherever you're joining from. Feel free to say hello in the chat if you'd like to. I'm Rachel Tranter. I'm one of the trustees of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, and I'm here today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Alex Kent. Warm welcome. We'll just wait for everyone to join and then I'll begin the introduction. So please do keep yourselves on mute and feel free to keep your cameras on and off. That's up to you, your choice. Lovely. Well, warm welcome to this event from the Commonwealth Heritage Forum. Hello all. Hello, Chris. Thank you for saying hello. This is the first of a series of 4 talks about heritage of risk. There's 3 further talks each Wednesday through to the 18th of December. So please do go on the Commonwealth Heritage Forum website to find the login details for the other talks in this series. Many of you may know the Commonwealth Heritage Forum is a charity that focuses particularly on conserving and education around heritage across the Commonwealth. We've got a number of live projects going on, and we also do this series of talks. I'm very grateful to all our speakers in this series. So today we're going to hear from Alex Kent about heritage at risk through coastal connections, case studies from across the Commonwealth. This is a special joint initiative between the World Monuments Fund Britain and English Heritage, and the aims of Coastal Connections are to build a global network of coastal heritage sites to address the impacts of climate change and share knowledge, experience and solutions through workshops and developing resources. This talk in particular will provide an overview of how risk to coastal heritage is managed at different sites and the organisations within and beyond the Commonwealth involved in it. So there'll be these case studies which will also touch on living with change and loss. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Kent about how these can present new creative possibilities for transforming coastal heritage at risk. Just a little bit about Alex. So Dr. Alex Kent has run the Coastal Connections project since February 2023. He's a geographer and a cartographer. He spent his first 20 years of his career in academia, most recently as a reader at the Canterbury Christ Church University. He's the former president of the British Cartographic Society, and he's now vice president of the International Cartographic Association, and he holds fellowships with the Royal Society of Arts, Royal Geographic Society, Society of Antiquities, and British Cartographic Society. So warm welcome to Alex. I'm now going to hand over to Alex. As you can see, Alex has his slides up, and he's going to be sharing his screen and his slides with us today. And we are recording this talk, just so you're aware. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation to take part in this series and to deliver this talk, which is really derived from my experience of leading the Coastal Connections project, which I'll say a little bit more about a little bit later on as we get through the talk. What I want to do is to give you a bit of an overview. There won't be a lot of time, I think, to go into too much depth. It'll be very much a case of dipping our toes in the waters, I think, of several oceans and that sort of thing. But first of all, I just want to say a couple of things about, I guess, my background and my particular approach in all this. Well, as Rachel's already said, I'm a geographer, and I've been in academia for 20 odd years before sort of getting into the real world maybe and joining the heritage sector with World Monuments Fund and English Heritage. I suppose what characterises my line of inquiry in all of this and what I'm doing is not necessarily what has been informed from the heritage sector, but more, I suppose, about what makes places places. You know, what is the special ingredient or the characteristics of a place that make it different from other places, and the processes and the complex mixture of processes that come together maybe to form that sense of place and what that also might mean for heritage. Now I'm working in this sector. I should say that I'm very lucky to live in a certain part of the world in southeast Kent or southeast of England, where I'm surrounded by spectacular coastal heritage like these examples here. So Dover Castle, that you might well know, Deal Castle and Walmwood Castle, just fairly close to where I live. Together, these are all managed by English Heritage, and they attract together several 100,000 visitors a year. So they're popular sites for people to visit, and they've obviously been sort of cherished now as symbols of national heritage. They've been on a journey of transformation since their initial foundation as obviously buildings associated with defence. There's a rare photo I've put in for you there on the left-hand side with Henry VIII in front of Deal Castle. So you don't often get a Tudor photograph, but there you go. I should say that even though I'm surrounded by these castles and South East Kent, particularly along the coast of Kent and stretching across the whole of the south coast of England, really, you see a few of these. It's not all the case that these are all preserved and maintained and conserved in a very high state. And I want to just draw your attention to one of these, just the other side of Deal, actually, about a mile up the north coast of Deal, Sandown Castle. You might not have heard of this, which is another device fort founded by Henry VIII. So not all of these places have really been on the same journey. Eventually, this Tudor castle, founded in sort of 1539, I think, succumbed to coastal erosion. It was demolished in the 1860s and again in the 1880s. The sea probably was more successful in its demolition than the troops were. And there's a repurposing of the masonry for the nearby Dover Castle. And you'll see from this snippet here of London Illustrated News that really there's not so much going for Sandown Castle. And something that you might read of with a bit of horror, particularly if you're in the heritage profession, if you have a look at this account from the demolition of Sandown Castle. It's been going on for some weeks. It says a large number of men on the job, which they found very difficult as the stonework is bedded in with concrete made of the old Roman cement, which is harder than the stone itself, and had to be blasted with gunpowder. Some hundreds of tons of stone have been sent to Dover. And then it says there's not so much historical interest belonging to Sandown Castle. Gives a little snippet a little bit further on, talking about the prisoners it's had and so on. And then it concludes with the walls vary in thickness from 11 foot to 20 feet. The quality of their masonry has been proved by the troublesome task of pulling them to pieces. So clearly a very different fate to the rest of those castles that I've been showing you. And this is Sandown Castle today. I took this out of a plane earlier in the year. This is what it looks like. We will return to Sandown Castle because this is quite a special site, I think, that a lot of people perhaps would overlook if they're thinking about coastal heritage. So we'll come back to it, think about all of that demolition and what's happened with coastal erosion, and we'll come back. It does have a happy story. Might not be an ending, a happy story. So since the 1880s then, as you probably know, attitudes to conserving our coastal heritage have changed somewhat. Here's another Henry VIII coastal defence fort or device fort, this time Hurst Castle on the south of England, sort of around the south centre really, right at the southern tip of Hampshire, opposite the Isle of Wight. You can see from the map there. And you'll also see the image on the left-hand side that it's located at the end of a very long, about 1.5 mile long shingle spit that juts out from the land. And that itself, that shingle spit, protects the salt marshes behind, which are, again, a very biodiverse and precious habitat. But if you see the castle where it is, it's pretty isolated, pretty remote, and it's also been expanded in the 1860s. It's grown east and west out from that Tudor fort, and it's grown these sort of huge gun batteries that were built to effectively counter the perceived French threats of new ironclad warships and other geopolitical response. But if we have a look at the condition of this castle a little bit, we can understand something of the process of coastal erosion and the risks that we'll start to see associated with that. Well, if you remember from perhaps geography O-level or GCSE, if you did that, you might remember the term of longshore drift and the processes of longshore drift about transporting shingle along the coast. And unfortunately for Hurst Castle, because of some beach work earlier on, sort of further west of the castle, that effectively stopped the replenishment of that shingle underneath the castle. And so Over time, it was washed away. The defences around the castle for the coastal processes, the groins were fairly weak, and that meant that the process of erosion was accelerated. So it had undercut the battery wall here, making them much more vulnerable. And again, what we see here is the impact of that. This is the just after the storms that hit in February 2021, when part of that East Battery collapsed. And that event precipitated the nomination of Hurst Castle to the World Monuments Watch, which is a selection of 25 heritage sites around the world that are at risk, that the World Monuments Fund makes every couple of years. And that also led to the birth of the Coastal Connections project, which is designed to share practical solutions amongst managers of coastal heritage sites worldwide to try and understand how we can better install and implement sustainable solutions. Well, you can see from this image again, just after that collapse, there was the immediate response of a stone revetment in front of the castle there, that battery, to prevent further erosion and this sort of thing in terms of the damage to the castle. And since there's the estimate that it would cost about £6 million to fund more substantial coastal defences around the whole of that seaward facing of the castle. But the difficulty here is that because of the compounded impacts of climate change to do with storm surges, increased precipitation and sea level rise, that really the castle faces an uncertain future. And it's perhaps at the vanguard, really at the front line of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is really how we deal and how other places deal with this idea of living with risk at the coast when we're thinking about coastal heritage. How do we conserve these very vulnerable sites over time, particularly if we've got impacts of climate change that might include, for example, coastal flooding, the corrosion of masonry that is accelerated through the salinity of the water, for example, and all sorts of other things to do with the intensity of storms and precipitation that comes from those, warmer temperatures that might adjust the balance of species and biodiversity that you see surrounding some of these sites. And again, perhaps it's important to bear in mind the interconnectedness, not just of those impacts and the influences and the differences, different let's say repercussions that they have, but also the connections that a site has with its wider environment. Hurst Castle being a real case of that. So obviously there are knock-on effects of climate change, sea level rise and so on, but that would mean that there's also increased storm surges at any given point if there is a storm that occurs, particularly more intensive ones. So we're looking with coastal sites then as being particularly vulnerable when it comes to the impacts of climate change. And we might just focus on the UK, but then even if we look more broadly, obviously you'll know this, I'm sure, that actually there's a wider threat, much more broad threat to coastal heritage around the world. We see here some quotes from some studies, the Vustukas study in 2022, rising sea levels may threaten 70% of African heritage sites by 2050, and so on. Single greatest threat to livelihood, security and well-being of the Pacific. And again, small island independent states particularly facing the brunt of perhaps the impacts of climate change. And again, that's something I'll return to a little bit later on. Something then that we wanted to respond to with climate change, responding to climate change with Coastal Connections, was the idea that really a lot of these sites are facing dynamic, but often highly volatile. They're located in those environments, and therefore, really, there are impacts that are very, very difficult to pin down and are incredibly complex in terms of the challenges that those site managers face for those different places. So effectively then what we wanted to do with Coastal Connections and a joint initiative between World Monuments Fund and English Heritage was to build a global network, as Rachel has already said, of coastal heritage sites for sharing expertise and practical solutions. The point being effectively that we want to understand not just practical solutions, but also the perspectives that are behind them. So they might be driven by all sorts of different things, particularly perhaps as being derived from the approaches or perspectives or beliefs in terms of how people connect with nature as well, and the building materials that they might use around the world. So we think it's only really by working together we can address and start to address some of these challenges. And I think it's also important to bear in mind with Coastal Connections that it's really about sharing perspectives rather than saying one perspective is right, obviously, and another one is wrong, or however we want to look at that. We're wanting to be open to share what those perspectives are. And that's particularly useful for places that are, as I said earlier, perhaps isolated or remote and don't really have access to understanding what the solutions are. So the approach that we took with this was to really combine a data-driven, research-led methodology with simply talking to people and getting an idea of what resources would be best for them and how would we best do this. So we started off with a series of workshops, and I'll mention that a little bit later, and then also developing fact sheets and all sorts of other resources as well that are in development. The point being that these are freely open and accessible, and will be, as well as this project goes on, so that we can help build a very useful compendium of case studies. And I should say that case studies are the heart of what Coastal Connections is all about. We wanted to get an idea of how climate change particularly is influencing and impacting heritage rather than understanding the causes of climate change. There's a lot of literature about that, but not so much about the actual impacts. And so what I started to do, I love maps. I'm a map maker, geographer, and whatever. I like to understand something through a map. So my approach to this project, as well as talking to people, was to apply GIS, geographical information systems, very simply to map where these sites were, starting with English heritage sites, and understand if, for example, they are located within 5 kilometres of the coastline, would they be worth having those conversations with and investigating, particularly if they wanted to join Coastal Connections, and if they had some useful experience to share with others. And the interesting thing here, of course, is if we're thinking about risk, there is obviously a very different set of risks and set of challenges that each of these sites face. So if we compare, for example, Peel Castle in Cumbria in England, right in the northwest of England, to Dover in the southeast, again, they're fairly close to the coast, each of them. Peel Castle, you have to access over a causeway effectively. But that doesn't mean that they're facing similar risks or severity of those risks, or even if they're vulnerable to the same hazard. So we do need to have that granularity. And again, we can apply this sort of approach if we're wanting to look at broader sites around the world, or cast our net broader to look at UNESCO sites and get an idea of those that are a few kilometres from the coast, again, to try and understand which of those might be worth investigating in terms of joining the network, those that are at risk, perhaps. And there are very few global data sets on risks to do with climate change that are particularly in general, but actually those that are going to be threatening coastal sites. So Climate Central, the coastal risk screening tool, is something really useful there that can help to give you a very visual understanding of those areas that are going to be at risk of coastal flooding for a successive series of years. So you can have a play with that and get an idea of how the model affects, of course, the way that, or presents the way that these different areas of coastline are going to be affected by coastal flooding from sea level rise. And that can be quite useful, again, if we wanted to identify sites that are at risk. So the Coastal Connections Network so far, we've been going, well, the workshop started just under a year ago, this last January. And so far we have about 40 sites around the world that are linked into this. And again, that's where we have conversations with site managers associated with these places. They might produce a fact sheet with us. They might speak at a workshop, for example, but ultimately they want to get involved and share and learn what they've been understanding and implementing and I suppose witnessing for their site, wherever that might be around the world. And there's a really huge variety of sites that we've got, some of which have been worked on by World Monuments Fund and others not. I mean, here's a good selection. Port Lockroy in Antarctica, really useful to understand what they're trying to do against the huge wind speeds they're facing there, as well as being by the coast in freezing conditions. And somewhere like Rapa Nui or Easter Island, again, the Moai statues, the approaches that have been taken there towards digitization, for example. and some other sites like Nelson's Dockyard in Antigua and Whitstable Bay, again, involving community initiatives. And sometimes whole cities like Venice have been involved with coastal connections as well. There's a fact sheet which we've produced that focuses on the Mosey system, which is effectively the raising and lowering of barriers to control the tides that flood the Venetian lagoon. And also some natural heritage sites. We initially started off the project thinking this was just going to be about cultural heritage, and then realized as more people started to join that actually natural heritage sites have got a lot to offer and a lot to learn, and in many ways actually are at the perhaps at the vanguard of trying experiments in terms of what actually works and what doesn't in terms of managing a coastal heritage site. And that could be really, really valuable. So some of the themes that we've developed from Coastal Connections in talking to site managers are shown here. There are 6 of these, and each of these then led to a different workshop. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail here, obviously, and the recordings are available on the Coastal Connections website, which is just wmf.org/coastal connections. But you can see here that there's a whole range of themes, some of which are to do with engineering, so whether that's hard engineering or nature-based solutions, and others much more to do with intangible heritage, to do with storytelling, and perhaps also understanding how best to communicate Indigenous and intangible heritage, which is sometimes a real challenge for a lot of places, but it's important to share these processes as well. So we started off, as I say, in January, 7 workshops. We've just had an 8th actually just now. We will have one on the 12th of December on risk, funnily enough, nice link following this talk, but that one I'll give you a bit more details on right at the end. Good number of people, good number of countries engaged so far, and as I say, about 40 sites in the network around the world. Interestingly, the spread of countries, seeing those taking part from South America, perhaps, and Asia, not so much maybe Africa. And the production of fact sheets, again, is something that we're developing, really because we want to address this gap in literature in terms of case studies. So these will focus on the significance of coastal heritage, the key challenges, the processes, the solutions, the outlook for the future. And because they're co-written by, or with, I should say, the site managers, we get some really interesting insights there in terms of how they're actually handling some of the difficult challenges that they're facing, again, with a view to showing what they're doing. And sometimes the outlook for these places is not all positive. Sometimes it's very uncertain. Sometimes, of course, if they're facing imminent sea level rise and it looks very, very difficult, they will find a solution, then it's important for them to say, this is our experience in living with that risk. This is how we handle it, perhaps psychologically, rather than necessarily come up with practical solutions all the time. Of course, I don't want to go into the sort of theory of risk too much at this stage. And what I'm going to do is give you some examples around the Coastal Connections Network and beyond in terms of how people are responding to and dealing with, let's say, that the broader idea of risk. But simply, as you see virtually everywhere, if you think about definitions of risk, it's effectively a combination of trying to understand what the threats are to a particular asset, whatever that might be, and how that threat might make that asset particularly vulnerable. And then, of course, understanding how that itself generates the risk. If the asset is of no value, then perhaps we might understand the level of risk to be a lot lower as well, or even if there is a risk that exists. So we tend to define the value of those assets and what they mean. And for heritage, I think that is very, very important. You might remember Sandown Castle at the beginning. Obviously, in terms of risk, well, that castle ceased being a military installation in, I think, 1863. And so effectively, risk then was all about how to manage the castle and maintain it for that defensive purpose. After that, in terms of its heritage purpose, of course, risk was not so much of a factor. But in terms of how we respond in heritage to risk, and I'm sure a lot of you will know how we might manage this from a heritage perspective. And again, I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but largely it begins with identifying what is of value. So defining historic places, like we see in this example, the ADAPT Northern Heritage Toolkit that the EU funded 2022, I think this was. So from defining those places, establishing what those hazards and impacts are, and then how basically those sites are going to adapt, how we can start to design mitigation or adaptation, I should say, measures, and then understand how we can implement those and evaluate what is actually happening. Again, thinking about adaptation as best responding to the impacts of climate change rather than mitigation, trying to change the causes so much. And some of the range of responses, well, let's start with the UK first of all, and then we'll kind of gradually go on a bit of a more or less a world tour over the oceans. And if there's time, we'll finish off hopefully at about 1:45. So if we think about Hurst Castle and places like this, again, something very, very important here that's high on the agenda is the whole idea of monitoring a site and understanding through that monitoring, for example, movement of the masonry, understanding the foundation, doing geotechnical surveys to understand what those potential threats and vulnerabilities might be, are really quite high on the agenda for a site like this. And again, generating a 3D model like this with LiDAR and terrestrial laser scanning or digital photogrammetry is a really useful way, not just, of course, of gaining a digital record for the sake of convenience, obviously, but being able to get an idea of the fabric and condition at a particular time and how that has changed over time is something that is really valuable. So monitoring change is exceptionally valuable. And linked with that is the idea of preserving somewhere by record as well. And of course, that's a favorite technique of archaeologists, obviously, particularly community archaeologists. There's some really, really good initiatives quite close to me as well here in Kent, Whitstable, Tankerton, Sandwich Bay, again, getting communities to come together to map locations of objects, wrecks, that sort of thing, particularly intertidal heritage, because it's very, very fragile, and then photographing those objects and assets so that there is at least a understanding of what is there at a given point in time. But monitoring really, really important in understanding how things are changing, and again, how those changes are maybe accelerating. So one of the key questions would be, how is coastal erosion accelerating, for example, or how is there a change that whatever might be the cause of that, how is that accelerating, of course, over time? And so for a lot of places, particularly maybe an example like this Mussenden Temple that the National Trust maintain in Northern Ireland, again, looking at that, just on the face of it, you'd say, well, somewhere like this is going to fall down any second soon. Hopefully it won't. But because of the extensive monitoring that is done and taking place inside the temple and around it itself in that building, we can understand how much movement is actually taking place, the level of vibration that comes perhaps not just from the movement of the cliffs, but the vibrations from the railway tunnel underneath and this sort of thing. But understanding that through that, we get an idea of its vulnerability, and its vulnerability is not perhaps as high as we might suspect just on first inspection by looking at it. So understanding the science of monitoring and observation is really, really useful when it comes to understanding change. And if we're then thinking about places that are particularly open to the elements, this is again Northern Ireland, just a little bit further east along the coast, somewhere like Dunluce Castle here. Well, this is very practical in terms of a monitoring solution, because we want to retain visitor access in a place like this, even though there's quite a high level of vulnerability from increased precipitation and rock falls, for example. So loose rocks, again, they can be dangerous. They can threaten the stability of the place itself. So we need to monitor what the movements are of those rocks, for example, so interpret weather patterns, and that then leads to the interventions that we might see, like soft capping, putting vegetation on top of exposed masonry, for example, or introducing some rockfall meshing to keep the cliffs in place, or injecting resin into the rock crevices, again, to stabilize some of these foundations of somewhere like Dunluce Castle, the rocks that the castle is built on. And also more practically, perhaps for managing visitors, just thinking about where the routes are likely to need to be changed so that visitors are kept safe. And again, somewhere like Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, this is very relevant as well, because here we've got a stretch of coastline on the North Cornish coast, in England that is highly, very dynamic. You see caves forming all the time, and where there has to be very active monitoring of that coastline and that site to ensure that visitors are kept safe as they walk around the site. Now, one of the problems or challenges, let's say, that Tintagel has, of course, is that you have the natural heritage of the site as well as the cultural heritage, and the access, the multiple access points that these places that are along the Tintagel coastline. It's places that where you can access the castle. So they need to be monitored so that obviously visitors are kept safe and don't necessarily go in places or on paths where they might be put in harm's way. There's a new bridge that opened in 2019 that some of you will be aware of, and that boosted not just the number of visits to the site, but also, of course, and access, but also the economy of the local villages and surrounding area as well. And I think one of the key things to bear in mind, and something that I sort of realized going through this project, is the importance of access. So as soon as perhaps a site deteriorates to the point where access is threatened, then perhaps that starts to challenge the perceptions of the value of a site. People want to be able to go somewhere and look at it. And that might also raise questions also about, for example, how they might access a site after looking at it digitally, perhaps if they see a digital version. And it's important to bear in mind, I don't want to dwell on this table for too long, but it's important to bear in mind that somewhere like the UK even, that has a coastline of, well, just over 3,000 kilometres, perhaps something like that, with defence worth and a coast length that has 18.3% of it that is covered with defence works or artificial beaches. Even somewhere like the UK, that is a small percentage. And that makes it then extremely difficult if we start to move to other places around the world that do not necessarily have the resources to be able then to defend the coastline to that extent. And really, if we're talking about defence on this table here, we're thinking about hard defence options. So if we move to somewhere a little bit warmer, if we go to the Caribbean, perhaps across the Atlantic, and have a look at some of the issues and some of the thoughts, the challenges that they're facing. Well, obviously, the Caribbean in general is highly prone to hurricanes. And in this part of the world, hard engineering solutions tend to be favoured. I'll go on to explore some others in a minute, though, but just to give you a bit of a flavour here, you've got a few forts and castles. Obviously, these are all post-Columbian era, if you see what I mean, where they're colonial forts. But effectively, if we're looking at the attitudes to risk here and how risk and vulnerability is managed for coastal heritage sites, largely these tend to be looked at as part of a broader stretch of coastal works and coastal defences if there is the funding available. So it's very rare for specifically coastal heritage sites to get specific protection, let's say building a seawall just to protect a coastal heritage site. It usually is part of a whole stretch, for example. So we might see some rock armour that's being installed at Fort Charles, close to Fort Charles in Nevis, for example, but it's more likely sometimes to be sandbags, much more rapid option for coastal heritage sites than anything longer term, where they're not part of a stretch of coastline that is receiving that level of protection. Perhaps something else to bear in mind with a lot of the coastal sites that we see in the Caribbean. I've put some other ones up here as well. Fort St. George, Montserrat, again, desperately in need of funding to help with the maintenance of somewhere like that. But quite often, if you're talking about digital preservation, what we see are collaborations perhaps with Western universities and other organisations that will want to undertake that digital recording, maybe with LiDAR, terrestrial laser scanning. But the key thing is to ensure that there is sufficient training and sharing of data afterwards, so that obviously those that are responsible for maintaining and stewardship of those sites then have a stake in taking it forward and understand how to use these really helpful data sources to be able then to better manage their sites more sustainably in the future. So some great practice that we're seeing in Trinidad and Tobago with focus groups and collaboration in terms of mapping to make things a lot more sustainable for the long term. There are some other approaches, though. If we have a look at Antigua for a minute, this is, you might recognize this if you know the island Fort Berkeley or Barclay, depending on whether you're visiting from the US or the UK, as part of the Nelson's Dockyard National Park. The fort here you can see on the end of that arm there was constructed in 1704, but there are all sorts of problems here. You can see that it protects the bay, which is one of the hubs, the real hubs of the Caribbean for yachting. So it's a very high economic cost here to that particular area. But that arm, if you like, that is protecting and sheltering that bay, the fort on top of it, there are lots of issues to do with soil desiccation. The vegetation tends to not hold the water. There are goats that tend to eat up the vegetation. All of these things exacerbate the erosion of the soil, and therefore then that starts to eat away at that arm, if you like, there. And that then creates huge problems potentially for the long-term future of the bay that we see within Nelson's Dockyard. So different ideas here then to introduce different types of vegetation to slow the erosion down, put fences to stop the goats chewing up the vegetation, and to maybe maintain and stabilize the fortifications using more hard engineering methods. But there's a key drive here also to monitor, again, what is going on around the environment. So looking at wave sensors to say more about height, direction, periodicity, that sort of thing, where environmental studies can then inform further initiatives that, again, might be more sustainable. And another approach that we've seen with Coastal Connections, this was a fantastic project, the Cassandra project that Mark Kanata talked about, where effectively they were using climate change modeling to inform how traditional forms of housing in Dominica and Grenada could be modified so that they would be more resilient to adapt to hurricanes, for example. Something really, really useful that comes out of that in terms of, again, the practical resilience that you might see for residential areas, not so much for heritage at this stage, but residential areas. And if we're thinking a little bit more about intangible cultural heritage, you might remember that Hurricane Beryl struck Barbados earlier in this year. And again, thinking about the damage to the economy was very, very important there by the government. But also what they're seeking to do now is to understand how fishing traditions, so the intangible heritage of those practices, how they've been affected by the hurricane itself. And again, it's easy to overlook the intangible and see, again, that the value perhaps of intangible heritage is something that in many ways is more portable. We carry it around with us, and perhaps ultimately it's something which will outlive the tangible heritage. That's a thought, maybe. For some places, if you go a little bit further north, rather a long way further north to Canada, perhaps then it's somewhere that it's really more of a race against time, and living with risk is perhaps more a case of trying to identify the valuable sites that are being continually exposed by erosion, for example, and also by the melting of permafrost. So somewhere like Red Bay, Labrador in Canada, for example, which has been a very important underwater archaeological site due to the whaling that took place at major Basque whaling area from the 1530s to the early 17th century. You had large galleons here, for example, and chalupas that were sank in the bay. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site designated in 2013. But the organic material that is being eroded away and revealing what is left of the archaeology, that tends to just then thaw and rot away. And I think Jamie Brake here, who's the archaeologist for the government there in Nunatsiavut, he basically says, I think there's a really interesting quote at the end here, it's very unlikely we're going to be able to save everything. So that whole idea of prioritization is something perhaps that we don't really take perhaps too seriously in this part of the world, perhaps in the UK, and it's something that I guess inevitably we will, of course. And again, maybe if we look to Canada still, we keep here and we think about the Northwest Territories, right in the corner there, northwest corner, Kulpak here in Canada. And again, a 500-year-old Inuit hunting site where, again, through erosion and the thaw of permafrost, the fact that these hut implements cultures are being unearthed and then effectively recorded, largely because as soon as they get exposed, or fairly soon after they get exposed to the air, to the elements, then they start to rot away. And it's interesting here that somewhere like this, the land could be lost as much as 20 meters of coastline in a single storm away for that shoreline. So that's something really quite staggering. And they say here that historical villages are being swallowed whole, along with piles of unstudied artifacts from early Inuit culture. So something very, very important to bear in mind. You've got some beluga whale bones eroding out of the soil on the left-hand side there, that image on the shoreline. And for sometimes places like this, perhaps, again, digitization might be the only way forward for preserving something of the material culture. Well, okay, so we're starting to turn a little bit now further south. We'll go to Fiji first. And again, I want to thank lots of different people. I'll do that at the end for supplying some of these great case studies through Coastal Connections and some of the images. But if we think about somewhere like Fiji, again, not so much like the Caribbean in its location, but ultimately, again, remote as an island archipelago. Again, that remoteness has enabled it to develop a particular resilience, like you see with a lot of the Pacific island cultures. I was in Hawaii earlier in the year and understanding more about that and more about the transportability of that resilience and that culture is something important that perhaps we can learn much more of in the global north, let's say. But for places like this, again, we have this rapid erosion, which has not been helped by the clearing of mangroves, particularly to make way for development for tourist complexes, hotels, that sort of thing. There has been some replanting, but that's been a huge issue. And not only that, but cyclones, again, taking away the mangroves. And in some of these places, over Laos, for example, the sea is encroached, they think, up to about 23 meters over 65 years. So that ongoing threat of erosion. But also, perhaps we see, again, lots of different villages that are reporting sea level rise to the extent that they can't walk on offshore reefs as much as they used to maybe 30 or 70 years ago. There's higher salinity, there's submergence of some of the foundations of houses that were on land. And, a lot of places have been flooded that before used to remain dry. And particularly for some of these places, like the old capital here, where Levuka this is, where you have the very important sites right on the coast where Fiji initially ceded to Great Britain, and then the opposite happened with Fiji gaining independence in 1970. Places that are hugely significant to Fiji that, again, are very near the coast and potentially under threat from sea level rise. But a lot of the time it's about convincing local populations that this is actually very, very important. And one of the directions that this has gone into, perhaps much more recently, has been an idea to create what is thought to be more resilient houses. Again, there's a board here instructing people to do this after a cyclone has hit. So instead of using traditional thatch, use more sort of robust materials with corrugated tin roofs. But the slight problem here is that during a cyclone, it's not really great to have corrugated tin roofs flying around. It's much safer perhaps to have the palm fronds or branches moving around. So that's something perhaps to bear in mind. On the right-hand side, we've got a sort of combination here of two different approaches at the same time. Some people in Fiji, though, realizing that, of course, the thatched way of construction is actually, it does have economic value in terms of retaining that housing, because people want to see and obviously then maintain through the traditional crafts and cultures those particular traditional ways of building. And there's investment in that needs to happen more often, I think. As we go a little bit further north, so just staying in the Pacific then, for now, we'll just touch quickly on Tuvalu. And you might have heard of the approach here that's taken. It's really quite radically different in terms of creating not just digital preservation of... my screen's gone funny. There we go. Can you still see my screen? Is that working?
We can just see Zoom. It says Zoom.
Oh, okay. I wonder why that's happened. Hold on. Let me see.
It's all right. Take your time.
Yeah. Let's see if I can get that back. How's that? Is that better?
That's it. Yeah, the
Yeah, good.
first digital
Okay.
nation. Yeah.
Thanks. Notification came up and I hijacked it. There we go. Yeah. So Tuvalu, for example, you might have heard of course, from COP27, this idea of creating a whole digital nation rather than just elements, of course, of its culture. Again, what is interesting here is the sort of total view of going straight towards digitization, but ultimately thinking that we are going to lose these islands. The highest point, I think, is only about 4 meters above sea level. And so this is something that really is felt is an inevitability. So you might remember Simon Kofi, who announced this initiative, saying, well, we live with realities of climate change. We have a responsibility to forewarn the world as to what is coming ahead. And perhaps what we see rather interestingly with what Tuvalu is doing is perhaps almost through the emergence or the evolution towards the digital, the embracing of the digital, is letting go of the material. And they say also that is part of their culture. And maybe that's something then as well as a lesson that perhaps they could teach us in terms of the broader world for our attitudes. Right, well, after that massive trip around the world where we've only just sort of dipped our toes in each of these different areas and got an idea of their approaches to risk, I think what we should do is maybe return to Sandown Castle. And I did say we would do this very briefly, and we can see the value, perhaps, I think, in many ways, in community. So even though we might say there are lots of different ways of approaching heritage that is lost, maybe, if we can call it something, I think heritage is always becoming something else, whether it's on the coast or elsewhere. You're just much more aware of that on the coast because coasts are dynamic and volatile, perhaps. But it means that there's a positive way that we can bring heritage, particularly coastal heritage, to maybe gain more relevance as we go forward. And this is an initiative that was set up in 2015 to basically create a community garden from Sandown Castle, from the ruins. And they've been very successful. They're on Gardener's World, which is a famous BBC programme, and they also won, I think, a couple of awards for their gardens. But ultimately, they're saying here the important thing, they want to create something. It's important to build something, create something where there is not anything, so they see it. So to create somewhere special. But interestingly, they're creating it at a place where, of course, there was always something there in terms of Sandown Castle. So some takeaways then from Coastal Connections, just really briefly. Well, this is what I've noticed so far. Heritage obviously transforms people and places. It's all about managing change if we conserve heritage. It's not about freezing time. Sometimes legislation is slow to catch up with that fact, that idea. Perhaps we want to hold on to something. You look at someone like Tuvalu, that's not a choice on a material sense. We need to understand more of the context, look beyond the immediate site to understand those different factors. We need to be more resilient by working together across disciplines and borders, particularly if we've got complex challenges. That can only happen, overcoming those, addressing those, if we engage with different stakeholders and we look beyond the borders of a site. The thing about the coast is everything is connected to everything else. I think what I've already said, we need to be more open to investing in the creative capital of the present. Yes, we need to be doing that rather than just valuing the past. Wisdom is meant to be shared, I think, in general. Certainly, some of the feedback from Coastal Connections, people are finding it really good to hear what other people are doing in terms of their approaches. It makes them feel empowered that they can maybe try something similar, particularly if they're isolated. Something a bit more broad here. Hope is important. So yes, it's good to have that wisdom, that hope, but community is essential. You can hope things by yourself and feel hopeful about the future, but really as a community, you perhaps define that heritage for future generations. So just to say, I hope that's been useful. I hope to see you if you're interested. There will be the next Coastal Connections workshop that will take place on the 12th of December. You can see it there, 5 o'clock. It's free to attend, lasts from 5 to 6:30, and we have talks and then we have a discussion afterwards. Really useful. You're all welcome. Everyone is welcome to these, and I hope to see you there. And so I just want to thank you, particularly to Heather, Jill Firkin, Andrew Richards and Karen Taylor that helped me with a lot of these case studies from the world, particularly Canada, the Caribbean, and Fiji. And yeah, that's it. Thanks very much indeed. Good to good to take part. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex.
Right.
I'm sure, like everybody, we've just been really fascinated by your talk and such important points that you raise. Thank you.
Really
This
welcome.
is now an opportunity for anyone that would like to ask questions. And apologies, I should have said earlier, if you've got a question, to pop it in the chat. So you can either do that, or if you want to put your hand up physically, or just, you know, wave at me to indicate that you've got a question, that would be great. Lucy, I've noticed that you've turned your camera on. Does that mean you've got a question, or you just wanted to pop your camera on?
I do have a question, but I've just typed it in the chat, so I'll just send it that way.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Okay.
great.
I'll read it out. That's lovely. Thank you. Right, it's just come through. So Lucy's question is there an issue around compounding risk as coastal sites are eroded, degraded? She's thinking of an example in Fife in Scotland. Is it Wemyss?
It's the Weems Caves.
Wemyss
Weems,
Caves,
yeah.
thank you. Do you want to just read the rest? Hang on.
Yeah, so the Weems Caves has a lot of Pictish and other kind of older Christian carvings in it. But there seems to be a link there between, as the site becomes increasingly damaged by coastal erosion, there's also increasing cases of vandalism as well. It's become a lot worse in the last sort of 10 or so years. Is that something that's seen in other sites? Is there a connection between the two sort of elements of risk there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So what I'm immediately drawn to, I mean, there will be examples, I'm sure, that people know of that are archaeologists where there is this compounding of risk. I think the example that what your question reminds me of is the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, where I've just come back from, and seeing a different kind of vandalism of a natural heritage site, where again we've got, for example, already increased precipitation that is affecting the stabilization of the rocks. There's erosion, rock falls that's meant that the visitor paths have had to change. But the compounding of that with vandalism is something really, really interesting. And that vandalism is the hammering of coins into the basalt columns. And when that happens, not only obviously it's not very good for the columns, they start to crack and so on, but actually the corrosion of the coins in the weather, particularly the chemical weathering from the materials in the coins and the chemicals, then starts to stain the rocks and then starts again crack the coin, crack the columns further, because the coins then start to split. So there is this compounding, not just of obviously the increased precipitation, but the fact that that is combined with the weathering of these coins to create further degradation. And again, this is a World Heritage site that, again, is something that people want to conserve and preserve. So that's a particular dilemma, and quite an interesting one, and maybe a unique one that they're facing, where, again, it's a tricky thing that they will want me to think about how they're going to solve. And again, talking to Kirstin Lemon, who was the geologist who was looking into this the other day in Northern Ireland, and they're thinking, is the thing to do to basically just wipe out, to get rid of all of these coins so that people don't think of it as a good idea and then do it, or to treat a few or whatever. I suspect that the thing is that once people see it and they think, oh, maybe that's a good idea, they do it. That if you get rid of them all, maybe that's the way to do it. But yeah, in terms of compounding other sites with vandalism, I suppose, it's been an age-old thing, isn't it? When you get that the sort of the revealing of more and more sites again and more materials, does that then cause vandalism? Again, I'm just thinking of some other sites that are quite close to me, in fact, Tankerton, the wrecks there, and Sandwich Bay. I'm not sure if there's been instances of vandalism. I'm pretty certain there's been instances of people digging around and taking stuff. They want to kind of see what's there, and if they find it interesting, take it, whereas the community initiatives are all about taking photos and leaving everything in situ. But yeah, I think particularly, it's a really good question, because particularly where you have the vulnerability caused by the weathering, by the climate change that exacerbates all the erosion, as well as people's behaviour, then that can be a real issue. But yeah, thanks, good question.
Anybody else have a question for Alex? I've got one, unless anyone Okay, there's another one here. So Angela's asking, is there evidence for differences in rate of wave erosion in different parts of the world? I can't say that word.
Yeah.
Versus, you know what it says, versus temperate regions. So equatorial versus temperate.
Equatorial. Yeah, now that's not something I know about actually at all, but it would be really good to find out, wouldn't it? Wave erosion. I think that, yeah, I think from what I understand, my limited sort of understanding of that dimension of all of this, is that if we're talking about the rates of erosion from different types of forces that are obviously generating waves, like the wind, for example, areas that are prone to hurricanes, obviously that's going to have an impact on the rates of erosion. But if we're looking also at temperature, and therefore the rate at which moisture is held by the sea, evaporation, and the impact that will have on salinity, then that also might compound with that. I don't know if, I mean, again, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, honestly, but I don't know if there would be a map of, for example, that rate, the difference in rate, as you say, for wave erosion, much more generally at a global level. That would be something that would be really interesting in looking at, because there are so many different local factors for this. I'm just thinking off the top of my head as well, you see, that if you've got a long, as you well know, I'm sure from meteorology, if you've got a long distance where there's a greater distance of fetch between one landform to another, that allows then storms to gather and generate their own speed and generate their own waves. And so from that, it wouldn't be difficult to assume that you would have global differences like the ones you're suggesting, and you'd also have local differences according to the morphology of the bays and regions that you'd be looking at. But interestingly, and I don't know where you're from, Angela, but something that the environmental surveys in Antigua were really interested in picking up on was precisely what you were talking about, the wave behavior, and thinking just more precisely about not just height, but direction, periodicity, this sort of thing. So if you can imagine that level of data being gathered and then obviously aggregated, that could be, I would have thought, something that would be very, very useful. But whether it exists or not, I don't know. I'm sure it does somewhere at a global level, but it'd be good to find out.
Oh, thank you. So, oh yes, she says she's from Kenya.
Right.
Thank you, Angela. That's great. All right, I'm just going to finish with one last question. So, Alex, you talk quite a bit about loss in your presentation. Does it always have to be a negative thing, loss? Yeah, can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really good point, Rachel. I think, one of the key things that I guess I've discovered in doing this whole Coastal Connections program is, let's say in the UK and potentially Western Europe as well, there's a bit of a fixation on the loss of heritage and what this might mean, particularly in the face of changing climates, and what therefore we might be able to do in terms of identifying pathways where we can, let's say if we're organizations that maintain heritage, identify pathways that might have various trigger points to say, well, is this a point of no return if we cannot viably invest further in maintaining a particular site, for example? And no one has, as far as I know, taken that step in terms of doing that, going down that direction. But I think it's really important, and this is where there are some really useful studies like Tanya Venture's study recently from Exeter that says, look, it's about the language that we use when we talk about loss. And actually, I'd maybe perhaps go a little bit further and say, maybe we ought to look at the coast, obviously, as an ever-changing dynamic environment, and therefore coastal heritage has to respond to that in many ways. And I suppose in the longer term, it's quite futile to think that we can preserve anything really by the coast, particularly. So we have to find out ways that we can go with that change rather than necessarily fighting it all the time. And that means, okay, that in one side of things, we might need to look at this through a lens of loss, but maybe there's also a way of looking at it in terms of transformation and creating something positive from this as well. And that might be, again, investing more in the creative and artistic capital that we have, particularly in coastal communities, that could also be part of our heritage, of course. And we don't have to necessarily always privilege the heritage of the past or privilege the valuing of heritage of the past, I think. So maybe that's something that perhaps I've come to realize. I think we're a long way from seeing the result of that, but I think it's something we have to be open to. Let's be open to the fact that some of these places are on a journey. Look at Sandown Castle. That's seen something quite creative. That perhaps it's those involved in its demolition wouldn't have foreseen, obviously, 100 or so years before.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex. Well, I think we're at time, but thank you to everyone that's joined us. As we've said, the recording will be available, so you can watch it again or you can send it to your friends. And there are 3 other talks in this series, so please join us for the next 3 Wednesdays. So yeah, I look forward to seeing you again. And yeah, Alex, thank you so much. That was really fascinating and such a,
You're welcome.
I think, actually very positive view of loss and how we can move forward. So thank you for that. I've been really inspired. I hope everybody else has.
Great. You're welcome. Thanks.